The early 1900s in America was a time of stark contrasts, a period when rapid modernization existed side by side with enduring rural isolation. Urban centers like New York, Chicago, and Boston were bustling with industrial growth, electric lighting, and the hum of factory machinery, while vast swaths of the country remained untouched by these changes. Small towns and rural communities, particularly in Appalachia, the Deep South, and parts of the Midwest, often existed in a near-medieval social and cultural landscape, where generations of families lived on the same land, farming, trading, and interacting with only a handful of neighbors. In these pockets of isolation, social norms were rigid, family bonds were paramount, and the outside world was a distant, almost mythical presence. Life in rural America was marked by hard work and survival. Families often had many children, partly due to the high child mortality rates of the time and the labor needed to maintain farms and homesteads. Education beyond basic literacy was rare, especially for girls, and formal schooling was often seasonal, dictated by the demands of planting and harvest. Communication with the outside world was limited to infrequent trips to nearby towns, letters carried by the post, and the occasional visit from traveling salesmen or ministers. In this environment, family secrecy was easy to maintain, and unusual or taboo behaviors could persist unchecked for generations. Society at large was steeped in a mix of Victorian morality and emerging modernity. The Victorian ideals of modesty, propriety, and rigid gender roles still dominated much of the social discourse, but the dawn of the 20th century brought with it subtle shifts. Industrialization and urbanization were creating new opportunities and social mobility, while newspapers, magazines, and early photography allowed for a greater dissemination of information. And sensationalism. Stories of oddities and aberrant families were a popular form of entertainment for urban readers, and editors often exaggerated accounts of rural misdeeds to titillate and shock. While these stories may have been sensationalized, they often contained kernels of truth that reflected the isolation and hardships of rural life. Medical knowledge in 1903 was rudimentary by today's standards, and genetics was only beginning to emerge as a formal field of study. Mendel's work on heredity had been rediscovered in 1900, but it was not widely understood, and misconceptions about inbreeding, degeneration, and family weaknesses were common. The eugenics movement, which advocated for selective breeding to improve human populations, was gaining traction in both the United States and Europe. While many early eugenicists focused on positive societal reform, their ideas often intertwined with moral panic and social stigma, leading to the public shaming of families deemed degenerate or genetically flawed. In rural areas, where families were more likely to marry within a limited community, such stigmas could become magnified, and the combination of isolation and superstition often gave rise to fear, rumor, and secrecy. Religious influence in rural America was profound. Churches were the cornerstone of community life, dictating moral norms, social obligations, and communal judgment. In some areas, strict interpretations of biblical law shaped attitudes toward family, sexuality, and personal conduct. Deviations from accepted norms, whether consensual relationships between distant relatives, unusual household arrangements, or other socially taboo behaviors, were viewed as sinful and dangerous. This religious lens both reinforced secrecy within families and heightened the sensationalism when outsiders learned of deviant behaviors. Clergy often played dual roles, providing moral guidance and acting as informal investigators, but their influence could also contribute to the stigmatization and shaming of families who strayed from accepted norms. The legal system in 1903 was also vastly different from today's. Law enforcement in rural America was sparse and often informal. Sheriffs and constables might cover dozens of miles of territory, making the investigation of unusual cases slow and inconsistent. Local courts handled most legal matters, and records were often incomplete or poorly preserved. In such an environment, stories of shocking family secrets could persist for years before attracting official attention. When authorities did intervene, their methods were influenced by contemporary social, religious, and moral frameworks, meaning that what we might now consider a case for medical or social services was often treated as a criminal or moral violation. Cultural attitudes toward women and girls during this period further complicated matters. Females in rural communities were expected to uphold family honor, marry within socially acceptable bounds, and maintain domestic responsibilities. Education and autonomy were limited, and women who deviated from expectations risked social ostracism. In extreme cases of familial abuse or inbreeding, the lack of social and legal protections left victims isolated and powerless, unable to seek help outside the family unit. When reports of such situations did emerge, they were often sensationalized, moralized, or dismissed as curiosities rather than treated as serious social or criminal issues. Finally, the media of the early 20th century played a critical role in shaping public perception of shocking or taboo stories. Newspapers and pamphlets frequently published sensational accounts of hidden horrors in rural areas, blurring the line between fact and fiction. These stories catered to urban audiences, fascinated by the contrast between their modern lives and the perceived barbarism of remote communities. Illustrations and photographs, often staged or manipulated, accompanied such stories to create a sense of immediacy and realism, even when details were speculative or exaggerated. This cultural fascination with the grotesque, combined with limited access to accurate information, created fertile ground for rumors, legends, and the kind of tale that would later be attached to the discovery of isolated inbred twins in 1903. In summary, America in 1903 was a nation straddling two worlds, one of rapid industrialization, scientific progress, and social mobility, and another of isolation, rigid moral codes, and deeply ingrained traditions. Families in remote rural areas lived in a self-contained universe where generational secrets could persist and societal norms were enforced both through religious pressure and communal gossip. Medical knowledge was limited, legal protections were weak, and social attitudes toward women and deviants were unforgiving. This historical context provides the backdrop for any tale of hidden familial horrors, an environment where shocking discoveries could lie dormant for decades, only to emerge suddenly and disturbingly into public consciousness at the turn of the 20th century. The understanding of human genetics was still in its infancy. Gregor Mendel's foundational experiments on inheritance, originally conducted in the mid-19th century with pea plants, had only recently been rediscovered by scientists around 1900. While Mendel demonstrated that traits could be passed predictably from one generation to the next, the practical understanding of how heredity affected humans, particularly in complex social situations, remained limited. What did exist, however, were powerful cultural beliefs, moral judgments, and pseudo-scientific ideas that linked family relationships, genetic purity, and social worth, ideas that could transform private family matters into public scandal when discovered. Inbreeding, the mating of close relatives, had long been recognized to carry biological risks, though knowledge about the mechanisms was rudimentary. Communities across history had observed, empirically, that children born from closely related parents were more likely to exhibit physical deformities, intellectual disabilities, or other health complications. While isolated incidents might have been dismissed as coincidence or God's will, repeated patterns over generations fueled superstition and social alarm. In rural America in 1903, where transportation and communication were limited, long-standing practices of marrying within small communities or extended families sometimes led to unintentional inbreeding. These situations, while often innocent in intent, became fertile ground for judgment, gossip, and fear. The social stigma surrounding inbreeding was not merely moral or religious, it had strong pseudo-scientific backing. Early eugenicists, whose influence was growing in the United States and Europe, argued that the degeneration of families through repeated close-kin marriages posed a threat to society. They associated inbreeding with physical weakness, mental deficiency, criminality, and moral corruption. While modern genetics has shown that the majority of children from first-cousin marriages are healthy, at the time, these claims were widely accepted. creating a climate in which families living in relative isolation could be labeled as inherently flawed or dangerous. The eugenics movement also intersected with race and class biases, further magnifying the social consequences of any behavior considered aberrant. Families who were already marginalized for poverty, rural isolation, or cultural differences faced intensified scrutiny if inbreeding was suspected or discovered. For women, the implications of inbreeding were particularly severe. In small, tightly knit communities, girls were expected to marry within social boundaries, and any deviation from the norm was often interpreted as a moral failing. In cases where incestuous relationships occurred, whether by coercion or circumstance, the victimized female had almost no recourse. Social pressure, religious condemnation, and legal limitations combined to create an environment in which abuse could continue unchecked for generations. The stigma associated with inbreeding was so potent that families often concealed relationships and births, perpetuating cycles of secrecy and fear. The isolation of rural communities amplified this effect, making it extremely difficult for outsiders to intervene or even become aware of these hidden dynamics. The P.S. Psychological toll of inbreeding, particularly in cases of incest, was profound. Victims frequently experienced feelings of shame, guilt, and confusion, compounded by societal rejection if the behavior was revealed. Children born from incestuous unions faced similar challenges. Physical deformities, genetic disorders, and social ostracism could mark their entire lives. In 1903, understanding of psychological trauma was minimal, and social services to address abuse were essentially non-existent. Religious counseling or family intervention were often the only available supports, and these were frequently insufficient or judgmental. This lack of institutional support ensured that inbreeding cases remained hidden or only surfaced when circumstances, illness, legal disputes, or death, forced disclosure. Beyond the individual level, inbreeding had broader social consequences. Communities relied on the appearance of moral and genetic health to maintain social cohesion. Rumors of incest, even when unproven, could fracture relationships between neighbors, damage reputations, and create long-lasting suspicion. Because rural populations were relatively small and interconnected, the sins of one family could be felt across the community. These dynamics meant that secrecy was not just a personal choice, but a social necessity, ensuring survival within the rigid structures of early 20th century rural society. The interplay between science, morality, and rumor created fertile ground for sensationalism. Newspapers and pamphlets of the period often published lurid stories of degenerate families, highlighting deformities, unusual behaviors, or bizarre household arrangements. While some of these accounts were based on actual cases, many were exaggerated or entirely fabricated to entertain and shock urban readers. The line between fact and fiction was often blurred, and communities that had experienced genuine hardship or tragedy were transformed into objects of public fascination. In the case of isolated inbred families, the combination of physical anomalies, secrecy, and social taboo made them particularly compelling subjects for sensational storytelling. Education and literacy played a role in reinforcing these ideas. Many rural families had limited formal education, meaning that their understanding of genetics and heredity was based largely on folk knowledge, anecdote, and religious instruction. Misconceptions about the consequences of inbreeding were widespread, and communities often relied on observable patterns, such as the appearance of deformities in children, to draw moral conclusions. These beliefs were reinforced by limited access to scientific literature and the occasional presence of traveling doctors or teachers who carried incomplete or biased understandings of heredity. The result was a self-perpetuating cycle. Families engaged in isolated practices out of necessity or tradition. Communities judged them harshly, and the lack of scientific knowledge prevented informed intervention or understanding. In some cases, secrecy became almost a formalized survival strategy. Families practicing inbreeding might deliberately avoid social interaction, move frequently, or concealed pregnancies to prevent discovery. Children might be sent to live with distant relatives, or household members might maintain separate living quarters to reduce the appearance of scandal. These behaviors, while adaptive, also reinforced isolation and vulnerability. When eventual discovery occurred, whether through accidental exposure, medical scrutiny, or law enforcement, the shock to the community was magnified. The combination of taboo, moral panic, and lack of precedent made these cases headline-worthy and morally alarming in ways that resonated with the cultural anxieties of the era. In conclusion, the early 20th century American understanding of genetics, inbreeding, and social morality created a perfect storm for fear, secrecy, and sensationalism. In rural areas, where isolation was common and communication with the outside world was limited, the consequences of inbreeding could extend across generations, affecting not just biological outcomes, but also social relationships, psychological well-being, and community cohesion. The interplay of limited scientific knowledge, religious and moral pressure, and the burgeoning eugenics movement amplified the stigma, transforming private family behaviors into matters of public scrutiny and horror. It is within this context, where science, superstition, and societal norms collided, that the shocking discovery of two inbred twin sisters in 1903 becomes both plausible and profoundly disturbing, illustrating the complex intersection of biology, culture, and human experience. The vast rural expanses of early 20th century America provided a unique backdrop for human behavior, one where isolation was both a practical necessity and a cultural norm. In 1903, much of the country was still dominated by small towns, isolated farms, and self-sufficient homesteads. Travel was slow, communication with neighboring towns infrequent, and communities often tightly controlled by social and familial networks. While isolation could foster resilience, self-reliance, and strong community bonds, it also created an environment where secrets could be maintained for decades, shielded from outside scrutiny. For families living far from urban centers, physical isolation was compounded by social and cultural separation. Roads were often little more than dirt tracks, susceptible to flooding, snow, or mud, and transportation relied on horses or primitive vehicles. Children might walk miles to attend school, and trips to the nearest doctor, market, or law enforcement office could take an entire day. As a result, families often spent long stretches of time in relative solitude, interacting mostly with immediate kin. Within this closed loop, private family matters, ranging from financial disputes to more sinister behaviors, could remain hidden. Isolation didn't merely conceal wrongdoing, it shaped the rhythms of daily life, creating a self-contained world in which generational patterns of behavior could continue unobserved. In many of these communities, the preservation of family reputation was paramount. A single scandal could ripple outward, affecting not just one household but the broader social network. This meant that unusual or taboo behaviors, whether economic exploitation, abuse, or incest, were often concealed, denied, or rationalized internally. Family members would develop elaborate strategies to maintain appearances. Children might be sent to distant relatives, unusual behaviors excused as illness or misfortune, and outsiders deliberately kept at a distance. In such circumstances, secrets became woven into the fabric of family identity. In extreme cases, as with inbreeding or systemic abuse, these secrets could persist for generations, passed silently from parent to child alongside social norms and daily routines. The psychology of rural isolation also played a role. People raised in such communities often viewed the outside world with suspicion, associating strangers with potential danger or moral corruption. In this environment, families were both protective and defensive, guarding their private lives from outside interference. This insularity, while understandable, allowed deviant behavior to remain hidden. Children grew up unaware that their families' practices were unusual or harmful. Adults learned to normalize patterns that outsiders might find abhorrent. Isolation, therefore, was not merely geographic. It was cultural and psychological, reinforcing secrecy and perpetuating cycles of behavior that might otherwise have been exposed. Religious and moral frameworks further reinforced secrecy. Churches were central to rural life, dictating behavioral norms, mediating disputes, and shaping perceptions of sin and virtue. Yet the same religious structures that promoted moral oversight could paradoxically enable concealment. Fear of judgment often silenced victims, and clergy sometimes lacked the knowledge or authority to intervene in complex domestic situations. In communities where appearance and reputation mattered deeply, families had both incentive and support for hiding transgressions. This dynamic created a paradoxical social environment, a community that valued moral rectitude yet tolerated, indirectly, the very behaviors it publicly condemned, provided they remained hidden. Historical accounts suggest that certain geographic and socio-economic factors amplified the likelihood of family secrets in rural areas. Isolated valleys, mountain communities, and sparsely populated plains limited contact with outsiders, while poverty restricted mobility and access to education. Families often depended entirely on their own labor for survival, reducing opportunities for children to leave the home or for others to notice abnormal behavior. In the SE conditions, unusual or abusive behaviors could go unchecked, interpreted by neighbors either as eccentricity, misfortune, or simply family business. The lack of formal oversight or institutional support meant that generations could live under a veil of secrecy, their lives shielded from law, media, and medicine. The role of rumor and social surveillance in these communities was complex. On one hand, gossip acted as a form of informal regulation, reinforcing norms and punishing deviations through social ostracism. On the other, it could be selective, distorted, and self-protective. Families adept at managing appearances could avoid scrutiny, while less socially skilled households might become targets of suspicion regardless of actual behavior. In situations where deviant behavior was particularly egregious, such as repeated incest or extreme abuse, communities often chose denial or willful ignorance, unwilling to confront the unpleasant reality. The logic was simple yet chilling. As long as the secret remained invisible, the family and the community could preserve their sense of normalcy. Physical isolation also intensified the secrecy of everyday life. Rooms were often closed off, children kept in supervised spaces, and households maintained strict routines to prevent outsiders from noticing unusual activity. Seasonal work and labor patterns reinforced these separations. During planting or harvest, families labored together on the land, leaving little opportunity for outsiders to observe domestic arrangements. In winter months, snow and poor roads further limited access. Even minor visitors such as itinerant peddlers or distant relatives were managed carefully, and tales of unusual households often came to light only when a stranger happened upon a rare incident that could not be hidden. The consequences of such isolation were profound for individuals caught in cycles of abuse or inbreeding. Victims frequently internalized their experiences as shameful, normal, or inevitable, unable to recognize the extent of their suffering or seek help. Children growing up in secretive households might never realize that their circumstances were extraordinary, while adults often normalized decades of harmful behavior. The combination of physical, social, and psychological isolation created a self-reinforcing system. Secrets persisted, abnormal behavior became routine, and exposure was both feared and rare. Only extraordinary circumstances, accidents, confessions, or external interventions could pierce the veil. It is within this context that the shocking discovery of hidden family tragedies, such as the case of two inbred twin sisters in 1903, becomes plausible. The isolation of rural America, combined with cultural emphasis on family honor, religious moral frameworks, and limited scientific understanding, allowed generations of secrecy to flourish. These hidden worlds could persist entirely out of sight, shaping lives and behaviors in ways that would seem extraordinary to outsiders. When finally uncovered, such cases were not merely shocking because of the acts themselves, but because they revealed the intricate, unseen social and cultural machinery that had allowed them to remain hidden for so long. In conclusion, rural isolation in early 20th century America created conditions uniquely conducive to family secrecy. Geographic remoteness, social insularity, economic self-sufficiency, religious authority, and cultural norms all combined to shield private behaviors from public scrutiny. Within this environment, abnormal, deviant, or abusive practices, whether inbreeding, systemic abuse, or other concealed behaviors, could persist for generations, unnoticed and unchallenged. The eventual exposure of such secrets, such as the discovery of two inbred twin sisters in 1903, was not simply an anomaly, it was the culmination of decades of isolation, secrecy, and social dynamics that allowed private horrors to exist in plain sight in 1903. The fabric of rural law enforcement in America was vastly different from what we expect today. Small towns and rural counties often lacked formalized police forces. Instead, law and order were maintained by a combination of local sheriffs, constables, and sometimes volunteer deputies. These officials were responsible for policing vast territories, which could include dozens of square miles of farmland, forests, mountains, or plains. Travel between settlements was slow and arduous, leaving many as effectively unmonitored. In such an environment, private matters within families, particularly those occurring behind closed doors, could persist unchallenged for years, sometimes even decades. It was a system that relied heavily on community reporting, rumor, and the occasional oversight by a minimally equipped law enforcement officer. Sheriffs and constables typically carried out duties that ranged from managing minor disputes to investigating criminal behavior, but their resources were limited. They often had no formal training, relied on horseback or primitive vehicles for transportation, and were constrained by the availability of local courts. Communication with state authorities was cumbersome, relying on telegraph lines, handwritten correspondence, or in-person travel. As a result, rural law enforcement was reactive rather than proactive. Officers often arrived at crime scenes long after incidents occurred, relying on witness testimony, local gossip, or confessions to piece together events. For families living in isolation, this meant that unusual or illegal behavior could continue largely undetected until a crisis forced exposure. In cases involving family secrets, investigators faced particular challenges. The tight-knit nature of rural communities meant that neighbors were both witnesses and participants in maintaining the social order. Families often presented a united front, denying outsiders access and shielding members from scrutiny. Rumors might circulate, but without concrete evidence, law enforcement had little authority to intervene. In instances of abuse, incest, or inbreeding, the victims themselves were often silenced by fear, shame, or loyalty to their family. Detectives had to navigate a delicate balance, extracting truth while contending with the community's resistance and potential hostility. Missteps could not only compromise investigations but also endanger officers, especially in areas where residents distrusted outside authority. Legal frameworks at the time also limited the scope of intervention. Criminal codes varied widely between counties and states, and definitions of offenses such as incest, abuse, or neglect were often vague or inconsistently enforced. Many behaviors that modern society recognizes as criminal or abusive were either unaddressed by law or difficult to prosecute without corroborating evidence. In addition, records were poorly maintained, making investigations dependent on oral testimony and the memory of local officials. Court proceedings, when they occurred, could be slow and heavily influenced by social and religious norms. All of these factors meant that rural law enforcement operated in an environment of uncertainty, where social pressure often outweighed legal obligation. Medical and scientific understanding, or the lack thereof, further complicated investigations. Physicians were rare in isolated areas, and forensic knowledge was minimal. Conditions such as genetic deformities or signs of chronic abuse were poorly understood, and doctors often relied on observation and anecdotal evidence rather than systematic analysis. Without clear medical evidence, law enforcement had to depend on testimony, confessions, or circumstantial signs, which could be incomplete or misleading. In rural families with hidden histories of incest or inbreeding, these limitations meant that patterns of abuse could persist unnoticed for generations until an unusual event triggered official attention. Despite these challenges, law enforcement in small towns did sometimes uncover shocking family secrets. Investigations often began with complaints from neighbors, reports of missing children, or medical anomalies. Officers who were persistent, resourceful, or simply lucky might uncover evidence of hidden abuse, unusual relationships, or concealed births. Once suspicion arose, officers would conduct interviews, search homes, and sometimes rely on confessions to unravel complex family dynamics. These investigations were laborious and fraught with risk, both physical and social, as officers confronted communities deeply invested in maintaining appearances. A single discovery could expose decades of secrets, forever altering both the family and the surrounding social landscape. The societal impact of these investigations was profound. News of hidden family scandals traveled quickly, amplified by local gossip and sensationalist newspapers. Stories of incest, inbreeding, or systemic abuse were particularly shocking to the public, striking at deep-seated fears about moral decay, genetic corruption, and social degeneration. In many cases, the community's reaction was as consequential as the law enforcement intervention itself. Families found guilty or merely suspected of deviant behavior were ostracized, their property and reputation jeopardized. Victims, though often freed from immediate abuse, faced lifelong stigma, and the community struggled to reconcile the shocking revelations with its previously idealized view of normalcy and virtue. In addition to the social consequences, the investigative techniques themselves often influenced the outcome of cases. Officers relied heavily on psychological insight, intuition, and the ability to read human behavior, as formal training was rare. Interviews with family members could be confrontational or coercive, and confessions, when obtained, were sometimes unreliable. Nevertheless, the process of uncovering truth in isolated communities required patience, persistence, and a keen understanding of local dynamics. Even the discovery of a single family secret could provide a glimpse into the broader social and cultural patterns that enabled it to persist. The discovery of inbred twins in 1903 illustrates these dynamics vividly. The investigative process likely began with subtle signs, perhaps reports from neighbors noticing unusual behavior, questions from local medical practitioners, or anomalies in birth records. Law enforcement would have had to navigate a delicate social landscape, approaching a family that had successfully concealed their history for generations. The combination of geographic isolation, social loyalty, and limited oversight created a formidable barrier to uncovering the truth. Yet, when evidence could no longer be hidden, the ensuing investigation revealed not just the immediate situation, but the systemic factors, cultural, geographic, and institutional, that allowed it to remain secret for so long. In conclusion, early 20th century law enforcement in small towns operated under severe constraints, limited resources, sparse populations, poorly defined legal frameworks, and the constant challenge of community loyalty and secrecy. Investigations into family matters, particularly those involving incest, inbreeding, or long-term abuse, required careful navigation of social, moral, and logistical obstacles. In isolated rural areas, families could maintain secrets for decades, shielded by geography, culture, and the limits of law. When such secrets were eventually uncovered, the revelation was often shocking not only for the immediate details, but also for what it revealed about the interplay of isolation, social norms, and the nascent capabilities of law enforcement in 1903. The eventual discovery of two inbred twin sisters serves as a case study in how private horrors could endure behind the veneer of rural normalcy, and how the painstaking work of early law enforcement could finally bring them to light in rural communities of early 20th century America, information traveled slowly but carried great weight. A single story, whispered from neighbor to neighbor, could evolve over months or years into a dramatic legend. This phenomenon was fueled by the isolation inherent to rural life, the lack of widespread literacy, and the human fascination with the taboo. Families who harbored secrets, whether economic, moral, or genetic, were particularly susceptible to becoming the subject of humor, as neighbors speculated about unexplained events or unusual behavior. Over time, these stories could grow, taking on elements of horror, fascination, or moral warning that far exceeded the original events. The role of rumor in these communities cannot be overstated. Unlike today, where information is transmitted instantly across social media, news in 1903 traveled on foot, horseback, or via letters. A neighbor might report that a child rarely left the house, or that a family rarely interacted with outsiders, and these observations could be distorted in retelling. Every retelling added layers of speculation, assumptions, and sometimes deliberate exaggeration. The stories often contained kernels of truth, but these truths were embedded within a matrix of fear, superstition, and cultural expectations. A quiet household could easily become the subject of whispered suspicion, and over time, the community's imagination filled in the gaps. One of the most powerful forces driving these myths was the interplay between isolation and taboo. In communities where inbreeding, incest, or other deviant behaviors occurred, neighbors often sensed that something was off, but lacked concrete evidence. The human mind, confronted with ambiguity and secrecy, has a natural tendency to fill in unknowns with conjecture. In rural America, this meant that a family with hidden horrors could inspire speculation about extreme behaviors, grotesque physical deformities, or moral corruption. Over time, these conjectures hardened into narratives that were repeated as fact, becoming embedded in the collective consciousness of the community. Local media amplified this process, even in areas far removed from major cities. Small-town newspapers thrived on sensational stories, which attracted readers and advertisers alike. Accounts of degenerate families, hidden horrors, or shocking confessions were particularly marketable. Editors often relied on second-hand reports, hearsay, and local gossip to craft articles that were intended to captivate urban audiences, rather than to provide accurate reportage. Illustrations or staged photographs accompanied these stories, further lending a sense of realism to events that were often exaggerated or entirely fabricated. The line between fact and fiction became blurred as local legends were transformed into published tales of horror and fascination. The social function of these myths extended beyond entertainment. Stories about hidden family secrets often served as moral lessons or warnings, reinforcing societal norms and values. Tales of incest, inbreeding, or abuse highlighted the dangers of deviating from accepted social behavior, creating both fear and fascination. In this way, rumors and legends were not merely idle gossip, they were tools for social control, communicating the consequences of violating cultural, moral, or religious codes. Families who were subject to such stories faced not only scrutiny, but also the possibility of ostracism, reinforcing the importance of maintaining appearances and secrecy. The transformation from rumor to legend was also facilitated by the human desire for narrative coherence. People are naturally drawn to stories that explain the world around them, especially events that seem anomalous or threatening. A quiet, isolated family in the mountains or valleys could be interpreted as the diamond of evil or deviance, even in the absence of concrete evidence. Community members constructed narratives that fit their moral frameworks and expectations, often attributing malevolent intent to behaviors that might have been innocuous. Over time, these narratives became self-reinforcing. The more the family was discussed, the more elaborate and terrifying the stories became, until the original truth was nearly impossible to discern. Psychological and cultural factors further intensified the creation of myths, In small, insular communities, collective memory and oral tradition played central roles in shaping perceptions of reality. Stories were repeated at social gatherings, in church, and during communal work, becoming part of the fabric of communal life. The repetition of these tales created a sense of inevitability. Events that might never have occurred were treated as historical fact, and the family in question became a symbol of transgression, moral decay, or danger. In this way, rural isolation and limited access to external perspectives allowed myths to take root and flourish. When law enforcement or outsiders eventually intervened, the myths surrounding a family often reached their climax. Investigators would encounter communities steeped in rumor, with narratives that blended fact, conjecture, and fear. Confessions, discoveries, or evidence were interpreted through this pre-existing lens of myth, heightening the shock and sensationalism. The discovery of the eye. Inbred twin sisters in 1903 is emblematic of this process. Their reality, disturbing and tragic in its own right, was magnified by decades of speculation, rumor, and fear. The shocking details of their existence and their eventual confession about their father were not only horrifying because of the acts themselves, but also because they validated the legends that had grown in the intervening years. The making of such myths also had long-term consequences for the surrounding community. Families implicated in these legends were often ostracized. Property could be devalued and the social cohesion of the town disrupted. Even generations later, the memory of these events lingered, passed down as cautionary tales, whispered warnings, or local folklore. These stories were reproduced in newspaper retrospectives, oral histories, and later in sensationalist books or articles, ensuring that the myth persisted far beyond the original events. In many ways, the myth became as real, if not more so, than the actual events themselves. Furthermore, myths often serve to simplify complex social realities. The history of isolated families is rarely black and white. There are layers of psychological, cultural, and economic factors that influence behavior. Rumor and legend distill these complexities into narratives that are easier for communities to understand and remember. In doing so, they often impose moral judgments, attributing evil, malice, or depravity where nuanced understanding would be more accurate. The twins' story, for example, is enveloped in layers of myth that frame their existence as shocking and unnatural, even as it obscures the broader social and familial conditions that allowed such secrecy to endure. In conclusion, the interplay of rumor, isolation, and cultural fascination transformed private family secrets into enduring myths in early 20th century America. Communities steeped in limited communication, moral rigidity, and social scrutiny were fertile ground for the creation of tales that blurred the line between fact and fiction. Small-town newspapers, oral storytelling, and human imagination magnified the drama, creating narratives that both warned and fascinated. The discovery of the inbred twin sisters in 1903 serves as a chilling example of how reality and myth can intertwine. The twins' existence was horrifying in itself, but the legend surrounding their family history amplified the shock, cementing their story in local and eventually national memory. It is a testament to the power of human storytelling, the persistence of secrecy, and the complex ways in which isolation, rumor, and fear shape our understanding of the past.